Imagine being sealed inside a wooden vessel while the world outside disappears.
For 40 days, rain falls. Then the rain stops.
But the nightmare doesn't. The waters continue rising. The ark drifts without a destination. There is no land visible, no horizon, no way to know whether the walls around you will hold. And inside are Noah, his family, and animals that must somehow survive a catastrophe unlike anything they have ever known. Genesis tells us the ark finally came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, but Noah did not walk out the next morning. He waited, and waited, and waited. From the beginning of the flood until the moment the doors finally opened, the biblical chronology spans roughly 370 days. So what actually happened during that year inside the ark? What did Noah hear? How did his family survive? What happened to the animals? And perhaps most mysteriously, what did Noah see when he finally stepped outside? The rain began as a warning, then it became a wall. Genesis describes Noah entering the ark with his wife, his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. Animals entered with them. Then, according to the biblical account, the door was shut. Outside was a world about to disappear. Inside was a wooden structure unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Genesis gives the ark enormous dimensions, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, divided into levels and covered inside and outside with pitch. The exact length of a biblical cubit is uncertain, but using a common estimate, the vessel would have been roughly 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. But its most important feature wasn't its size. It had nowhere to go. The ark was not described as a ship designed to navigate toward a harbor. It was a survival vessel. And Noah was not its captain. He was its passenger. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories behind history, subscribe to Chronicle Nexus and join us as we uncover the mysteries that shaped our world. Because the story of Noah's Ark is usually told as a story about the flood, but Genesis actually gives us something much more unusual. It gives us a story about waiting. The biblical chronology begins with a precise date. Noah was 600 years old when, on the 17th day of the second month, the springs of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights, but that was only the beginning. The waters rose, the ark lifted, and everything that had once represented normal human life began disappearing beneath the surface. Genesis says the waters covered the mountains and that every living thing on dry land died. Whether someone reads that account as a literal global catastrophe, a theological narrative built around an ancient regional disaster, or a combination of historical memory and literary tradition, one thing is undeniable. The ancient writer imagined catastrophe on a scale beyond ordinary human control, and for Noah's family, the catastrophe wasn't simply about surviving the first storm. It was about surviving everything that came afterward. Imagine the first night. The ark is moving. Not sailing in the normal sense, moving because the water beneath it is moving. There is no steering toward a known destination. No lighthouse, no shoreline, no map that can tell Noah where he is. Outside, rain crashes against the roof. Inside, 8 people are surrounded by animals. The ark is dark. The air is heavy. The sounds must have been overwhelming. Animal calls, wood creaking, water striking the hull, people moving through narrow spaces. And somewhere beyond the walls, a world they knew was being transformed. Genesis says that after 40 days, the waters continued to prevail over the earth. This detail is easy to overlook. The rain lasted 40 days and 40 nights. But the flood narrative lasted much longer. Genesis says the waters prevailed for 150 days. Then the turning point arrives. The text says that God remembered Noah and the animals with him. A wind passes over the earth. The waters begin to recede. And the ark eventually comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. This is where the story becomes strangely quiet, because Noah has survived the catastrophe. But he is not free. The ark has stopped moving, and still he cannot leave. Genesis says that the tops of the mountains become visible in the 10th month, but Noah continues waiting. 40 more days pass. Then he opens the window and sends out a raven. Why a raven? The text doesn't explain. The bird goes back and forth until the waters have dried from the earth. Then Noah sends out a dove. The dove finds nowhere to land, so it returns. 7 days later, Noah sends it again. This time, it returns with a freshly plucked olive leaf. For the first time, Noah receives something that resembles a message from the outside world. The earth is returning. Life is returning. But Noah still waits. 7 more days pass. He sends the dove again. This time, it does not return. The silence becomes the answer. The ground may be drying, but Noah does not simply open the door. He waits for the command. That detail matters, because the flood story is not primarily a story about Noah controlling his circumstances. It is a story about Noah enduring them, and that may be the hardest part of the entire narrative. We tend to imagine the ark as a place of safety, but safety does not necessarily mean comfort. The Bible never tells us that the year inside the ark was peaceful. It never tells us how they fed every animal. It never tells us how waste was handled. It never describes their sleeping arrangements. It never tells us exactly how much food was stored. Those details are simply not given. And that silence has created centuries of speculation. How could 8 people care for so many animals? How could the ark remain structurally intact? How much water and food would have been required? How was ventilation handled? What kind of wood was used? And what exactly does the biblical word translated as ark mean? These questions are reasonable, but they belong to a different category from what Genesis actually tells us. The biblical narrative gives us the story. It does not give us an engineering manual. And this is where the historical mystery surrounding Noah's Ark becomes fascinating, because long before modern archaeology, ancient Mesopotamia already contained stories of catastrophic floods. One of the most important is the Atrahasis epic. Another appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In these traditions, a chosen survivor receives a warning, constructs a large vessel, survives a devastating flood, releases birds, and eventually offers sacrifice after reaching safety. Scholars have therefore spent more than a century comparing these stories with Genesis. The similarities are too substantial to ignore. But neither should we simplify the question by saying Noah is just Gilgamesh. The ancient Near East was a world where stories traveled.
Flood traditions could be preserved, transformed, retold, and adapted.
The earliest surviving Mesopotamian flood traditions are centuries older than the surviving manuscripts of the biblical flood story. Many scholars therefore see Genesis 6 through 9 within a broader Mesopotamian literary environment, but Genesis changes the meaning of the flood. In Mesopotamian traditions, divine beings can act for competing reasons. In Genesis, the flood becomes part of a moral narrative centered on human violence, judgment, survival, and covenant. The comparison doesn't prove that Noah never existed. It also doesn't prove that the biblical flood happened exactly as described. What it proves is that ancient people throughout the Near East remembered catastrophic flooding and used that memory to ask enormous questions. Why do civilizations collapse? Why does evil survive? Why are some people spared? And what does humanity do after catastrophe? Those questions bring us back inside the ark, because the strangest thing about Noah's survival may not be the rain, it may be the silence. For months, Noah's family is separated from the world. No crowds, no markets, no neighbors, no cities. No normal human society. Only 8 people. Imagine what that does to the mind. Every day begins with the same walls, the same animals, the same smell, the same darkness. And beyond those walls is an unknown world. They cannot know whether the water is falling. They cannot know whether the mountains are visible. They cannot know whether the earth outside has begun to recover. They can only wait for information, first the raven, then the dove, then the olive leaf. Then nothing. The dove does not return. For Noah, that tiny bird may have represented the greatest discovery of his life. The world was becoming habitable again. But another mystery remains. Where exactly did the ark come to rest? Genesis says the mountains of Ararat. That wording is important. It does not necessarily identify the modern summit known as Mount Ararat. The ancient term can refer to a broader mountainous region associated with ancient Urartu. Over the centuries, however, tradition increasingly connected Noah's Ark with Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey. And that association has inspired explorers, adventurers, archaeologists, and treasure hunters for generations. Some have claimed to see wooden remains. Others have reported unusual formations. Still others have claimed photographs, radar scans, or geological anomalies. But none of these discoveries has produced universally accepted archaeological proof of Noah's Ark. One site in particular has attracted extraordinary attention. The Durapinar Formation in eastern Turkey is a large boat-shaped geological feature that some Ark researchers argue could be the remains of the biblical vessel. The formation was identified in the 20th century and has repeatedly generated headlines. More recently, researchers investigating the site have reported radar anomalies, soil differences, and possible subsurface structures. These findings have been presented by proponents as evidence that something artificial may exist beneath the formation. But there is a crucial distinction. Interesting evidence is not the same as confirmation. The formation remains disputed. Geologists have long debated its natural origins, and no universally accepted archaeological excavation has demonstrated that it is Noah's Ark. That distinction is essential, because if the Ark is ever discovered, the evidence would need to withstand independent examination, geological analysis, archaeological dating, and peer review. A photograph alone would not be enough. A boat-shaped hill would not be enough. Even pieces of ancient wood would not automatically prove the biblical story. The question would be much harder. Was the material actually part of a vessel? Is it old enough? Was it constructed by humans? Does its date fit the proposed historical setting? And can the evidence be independently verified? Until those questions are answered, the Ark remains one of history's most famous, unresolved mysteries. But there is another question. What kind of flood could have inspired the story? Ancient Mesopotamia was shaped by rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates could transform fertile plains into deadly landscapes. Archaeology has found evidence of ancient flooding in Mesopotamian settlements. There have also been major debates over dramatic flooding events elsewhere in the ancient Near East, including theories surrounding the Black Sea. None can simply be labeled Noah's flood. There is no archaeological artifact carrying a label that says, "This is the flood of Genesis." Instead, researchers examine layers of sediment, ancient settlements, river systems, climate records, and written traditions. Some scholars believe the Genesis narrative may preserve memories of severe regional flooding that became magnified through generations of storytelling. Others, particularly within religious communities, maintain that the biblical account should be understood as a global flood. And some readers simply acknowledge that the surviving evidence does not allow the question to be settled. That uncertainty is not a weakness, it is part of the mystery. Do you think this event was a miracle, a natural phenomenon, or something history can no longer explain? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Because regardless of how someone interprets the flood, Genesis gives us a remarkably human ending. After almost a year inside the ark, Noah finally receives the command to come out. Genesis gives another precise date. It is the 27th day of the second month of Noah's 601st year. From the beginning of the flood to this moment, the chronology spans roughly 370 days, more than a year. A year without normal civilization, a year surrounded by water, a year of uncertainty. And then the door opens. Think about that moment, the first sunlight. The first breeze, the first sound that isn't coming from inside the ark. The first time Noah sees the landscape. The ground is dry. The animals begin leaving. Creatures that had spent months confined to the ark return to the open world. Noah's family follows, and then Noah builds something, an altar, before rebuilding a house. Before planting crops, before creating a settlement, before returning to ordinary life, he offers a sacrifice. The story moves from survival to remembrance, and then comes one of the most important moments in Genesis. God establishes a covenant. The sign is a rainbow. The flood is not simply followed by survival. It is followed by a promise. The world will not again be destroyed by a flood in the same manner. And suddenly, the ark takes on a different meaning. It was not merely a container, it became a boundary between two worlds. Before the ark, there was violence. Inside the ark, there was waiting. After the Ark, there was rebuilding, and that pattern may explain why the story has survived for thousands of years. Because every civilization eventually faces its own version of the flood. A war, a plague, a collapse, a fire, a financial disaster, a destroyed city. A family tragedy, a world that suddenly stops looking familiar. And in those moments, the human question becomes the same. How do we survive when the world we knew disappears? Noah's story doesn't give us an engineering blueprint for surviving catastrophe. It gives us something more ancient. A story about endurance. The strange thing about the Ark is that Noah could not see where he was going. He could only trust that the journey had a destination. For most of the year, there was no spectacular miracle happening every morning. There was waiting. Routine, fear, work, silence, and uncertainty. That may be the part of the story we understand better than we realize. Because surviving a catastrophe is rarely one dramatic moment, it is usually thousands of small moments. One more day, one more meal, one more night, one more reason to keep going. Then, eventually, the waters begin to fall. The mountain appears. The bird returns. The bird leaves, the ground dries, and the door opens. But the final mystery is not whether Noah survived the flood. The final mystery is what survival meant afterward. Noah walked into a world without the society he had known. There were no familiar neighbors waiting outside, no marketplace, no crowd celebrating, no city to return to. Only a landscape transformed by catastrophe. In that sense, Noah did not simply survive the old world. He inherited the responsibility of helping create the new one, and perhaps that is why the story ends not with the Ark, but with a covenant. The catastrophe is over. The real challenge has begun. What do you do after the world ends? How do you rebuild? How do you remember? How do you prevent the violence that came before? And how do you find hope when the evidence of destruction is everywhere? Thousands of years later, we are still asking those questions. Archaeologists continue searching ancient landscapes. Scholars continue comparing cuneiform tablets with biblical manuscripts. Geologists continue examining ancient flood deposits. Explorers continue looking toward the mountains. And believers continue reading Genesis as a story of judgment, preservation, and covenant. Perhaps one day, archaeology will reveal something that changes the conversation. Perhaps the Ark will remain hidden forever. Perhaps the flood was a historical catastrophe remembered through generations. Perhaps the story preserves several layers of ancient memory. Or perhaps its deepest meaning was never dependent on finding a piece of wood on a mountain. What we know is that the flood tradition is extraordinarily old. We know that ancient Mesopotamia preserved multiple stories of catastrophic flooding. We know that Genesis contains a carefully structured chronology of Noah's ordeal, and we know that the question of the Ark has fascinated humanity for centuries. But inside the story is something even more enduring. A man enters a vessel because the world outside has become dangerous. He cannot control the storm. He cannot control the water. He cannot see the destination. He can only endure. And eventually, after almost 370 days, The door opens. The first world is gone. A new one waits outside. Maybe that is the real mystery of Noah's Ark, not whether we can find the vessel, but whether we understand what the story has been trying to tell us about survival. Because sometimes history is not preserved in ruins, sometimes it survives in stories. And sometimes the most important question is not whether the Ark existed exactly as we imagine it. It is why, thousands of years later, we are still standing at its door. Still looking inside, still asking what happened during those long months of darkness, and still wondering what Noah saw when he finally stepped into the light. If you enjoyed this journey into history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Chronicle Nexus, and share it with someone who loves history and mystery. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you in the next Chronicle.